can lead to lower labor productivity. It can increase the cost of working, increase mortality risk, and in countries like the U.S., which is what this paper focuses on, it can increase out-of-pocket medical expenses, and it can increase also the chance of getting onto disability insurance programs like Social Security disability insurance or supplemental Social Security insurance, SSDI and SSI. And if you just look at like raw correlations in the data for the US, what you'll see is that individuals in poor health have lower earnings in labor supply. So given that this is the case, what we are interested in doing here is thinking about how important is, the fact that there's people are vary in their amount of health, and this, extent of health inequality varies over the life cycle on lifetime earnings inequality. And in addition, we're interested in understanding kind of what are the key channels and among these different channels. But in particular, we want to understand, how important is it that these people have high probability of getting on social insurance programs, for this impact versus the fact that they have lower labor productivity and higher disutility of work. So to answer these questions, we do several things in this paper. First is we construct an objective measure of health, the frailty index, which I talked about yesterday quite a bit, and I'll just briefly give an overview of today. But it's a very simple measure of health. It's just a cumulative sum of all past adverse health events or adverse health events. And then in an empirical analysis, we just look at the impacts of changes in health on current earnings. And we do this using PSID data and a dynamic panel estimation approach. We estimate the effect of health on current earnings, and then we look at the impact on various margins through which health impacts earnings, like hours, wages, and participation. And in this empirical analysis, just to give you some of the punchline now, we find that the effects of health on current earnings are large, and that they work primarily through the participation margin. So then, given the findings from this empirical section, we build a structural model that's consistent with these findings. And agents in our model are going to have heterogeneous and risky health profiles. And then we're going to use the structural model to answer our question of how important is health inequality for lifetime earnings inequality. And then through a series of counterfactual experiments with the structural model, we look at the relative importance of each of these channels through which health impacts earnings that I've mentioned already. And just to give you a sense of what we find that health inequality accounts for 30% of lifetime earnings inequality at age 65. And lifetime earnings means just cumulative earnings up to that age. So this is like total cumulative earnings up to age 65. 30% of the variation in this earnings is due to health inequality. So this is quite large. And we find that 2/3 of this effect is due to the fact that individuals in poor health have a higher probability of getting onto disability insurance programs, SSDI and SSI. And then at the very end, we say, well, okay, so basically we find that these programs, SSDI and SSI, have a large impact on lifetime earnings inequality through this channel, that they make it easier. People in poor health have a high probability of getting in these programs. And as a result, many of them exit the labor force, at relatively young ages, pre-retirement ages, and go on to these programs. And this contributes to lifetime earnings inequality. So given that this is the case, maybe we should get rid of these programs. They contribute to inequality. Yet we find actually exactly the opposite. If we remove these programs, welfare declines. So from an ex-ante perspective, these programs are actually welfare improving. So it seems basically, and you'll see as I go along in our model, even though these programs, consumption inequality also increases when we, because of these programs. So consumption inequality falls when we remove these programs. But in our model, welfare inequality, removing these programs actually hurts people in terms of welfare. So people in poor health are happy to trade to trade consumption, take lower levels of consumption to avoid having to work because they incur high disutility of work and have relatively low productivity when they are working. That's essentially what this implies. Okay, so let me just quickly talk about how we measure health, because for those who were at the talk yesterday, you already saw some of this. We measure health, like I said, as a frailty index. And this is a cumulative sum of all adverse health events, which are, you can call these things deficits. It comes from gerontology, where it's been widely used and studied. The types of deficit variables that we use to construct the index in PSID can kind of be put into three broad sets. Variables about difficulties with activities of daily living, like are you able to eat without assistance? Are you able to dress yourself without assistance, and so on. Diagnoses variables, where they ask PSID respondents, has a doctor ever diagnosed you with heart disease? Has a doctor ever diagnosed you with psychological problems, and so on. And we also have some body measurements, like do you have a BMI over 30? So what we basically do is we assign a value of 1 whenever a person has what you would call a deficit based on these answers, and 0 otherwise. We add up the total number of deficits an individual has at each moment in time, at any point that we observe them in each wave. And then we normalize this number so that it lies between 0 and 1. So essentially the frailty index is just of all the deficits we could possibly observe for each individual, what fraction of them do you actually have? And I'm not going to go on about why I think this is a good measure, but if you weren't at the talk yesterday, I have a related paper where we kind of extensively explore this measure. And we argue that I think it has several advantages, particularly for studying health dynamics in structural models and for studying health. When you're particularly interested in studying health contingent policies in these models, because ultimately you really want an objective measure of health, not a subjective one. I think to think about policies like SSDI, which are based on objective measures of health, not based on people's self-report of whether they think they're in bad health, for example. But there's several reasons why this is a nice measure. One of which you're going to see right now, which is that also this index, it's a richer measure of health in terms of the amount of variation in health we can see, and you can treat this frailty index as a continuous variable, and the variation in it has meaning in terms of the severity of health changes. And so, like in the empirical section, we're going to think about the frailty index as a continuous variable, and it's going to be able to estimate marginal impacts of changes in health on things like earnings. Okay, so just quickly to give a sense of what this thing looks like. Here's the cross-sectional distribution of frailty in the sample overall. These are box plots of frailty by age. You can see that frailty increases with age, it decreases with education. Differences by education are larger than by gender, and there are dramatic differences by education and in the entire kind of dynamics of frailty over the life cycle. And this is something that we're going to think about carefully in the model. So we're going to essentially allow frailty dynamics to be different, completely different for each of these education groups to match this difference in their life cycle frailty dynamics that we see in the data. I said it's highly skewed, both because there's a significant fraction of people who have 0 frailty. That fraction declines with age. And there's a significant thin right tail of highly frail people. And you see this thin tail at all ages. And finally, we see both positive and negative changes in frailty wave over wave, about 42% of the time. So frailty is very persistent. More than 50% of the time there's no change, but we do see changes both up and down, and that's going to be important for estimating the impacts of changes in frailty on earnings. Okay, so let's talk about the empirical analysis. So like I said, we want to understand the impact of health measured by frailty on earnings, and then the different components of earnings. So we're going to estimate the following regression, where the left-hand side variable is going to be the log of earnings or later hours or wages. And we're going to regress that on a fixed effect plus frailty, and then 2 lags of the left-hand side variable. and a vector of exogenous controls. And the way we're going to do this estimation is with a Blundell-Bond system GMM estimator. And why are we doing this Blundell-Bond system GMM estimator instead of something just like a fixed effects estimator? Well, fixed effects estimator is biased when you have these lags of the left-hand side variable on the right-hand side. But in general, we think it's very important to control for fixed effects because we're concerned about things like innate ability, which are likely highly correlated with both earnings and health. And we want to include lagged values of earnings on the right-hand side here because earnings is highly persistent variable and frailty is a highly persistent variable. And there's general concerns, I think, when you're trying to understand the relationship between these two variables about what maybe is sometimes called dynamic endogeneity. Past earnings could impact future frailty, past frailty could impact future earnings. And the Blundell-Bond system estimator is really exactly designed to deal with this type of problem. And I'm not going to go in more detail beyond that about the estimator, but if you're interested or concerned about robustness, there's like 30 pages of appendix where we do extensive robustness and testing of our results. And I'm going to just show you the main results, and I'm going to show you actually instead of gamma, I'm going to show you gamma divided by 27, which is the responsive earnings or hours to one more deficit. So how does earnings change when an individual gets one additional health deficit? So if we look at the overall sample at everyone, find that when frailty increases by one additional deficit, earnings declines by 20% on average. But this effect is concentrated in less educated people and individuals in bad health. So here you can see that we get much bigger effects for the non-college groups, smaller and maybe perhaps not even significant effect for the college group. And the effect is essentially only present in the bad health group. Here, bad health is defined as people who are above the 75th percentile of the frailty distribution. So it's really the variation in frailty in the top tail of the distribution, which matters for impacts of frailty on earnings. Nothing, there's not that much going on in the, healthy, for the healthier, like up 0 to 75th percentiles of the distribution. This is also why I think it's valuable to use frailty because, this variation and capturing it well is really going to be crucial for studying the impacts of health inequality on lifetime earnings inequality. Okay, and then we look at just people who are continuously employed, and we see that the impacts of changes in frailty on earnings are dramatically smaller. This indicates that the impacts are primarily through the participation margin. We do the same thing for hours, and we get very similar results. Similar magnitudes of effects on hours for everybody, again, concentrated in less educated people and individuals in bad. But you see no effect on hours. Then finally, we look at the impact on wages, and we do find some effects. Again, they're concentrated in less educated people, and we don't really see much here, but they seem to be concentrated perhaps in the bad health group. Okay. Then the last thing we do is we flip everything around. So I said that it's possible that earnings could also be impacting frailty. So then we experiment to see whether or not we can find any effects of earnings on frailty. And so we now put frailty on the left-hand side and log earnings on the right, and we don't find any effects. And for some people, this may be surprising, but it's actually very consistent with the empirical literature that has, people have looked for impacts of changes in earnings or changes in wealth or like job loss on health. And there's very little evidence that there are effects. And, they look both over, this is really like looking over a very short run, this is really 2 years because PSID is 2 years over this period, but there's very little evidence of effects even over longer run periods. And so because of this finding and also the empirical literature, we're going to treat frailty as exogenous in our model. We're not going to model any types of effects going from frailty back to earnings, just because we really don't see evidence that they exist in the data. Okay, so to summarize, increases in frailty reduce earnings in hours. We see that the effect is primarily driven by the employment margin and concentrated in less educated and less healthy individuals. And right away, these findings, we found these pretty large effects of frailty on earnings. So this suggests that health inequality may be important for lifetime earnings inequality. The fact that it all works through the participation margin suggests that social insurance may play an important role. So now we're going to move on to the structural model to quantify this impact and look at the various channels. Okay, so here's an overview of the model. It's a J-period overlapping generations general equilibrium model. Individuals are going to be subject to exogenous frailty shocks, productivity shocks that are uncorrelated with frailty, and the risk of job separation from their employer. It's an annual period model, so we're going to kind of capture, short-term unemployment separation. We're going to assume that individuals who are separated from their employer can pay a one-time wage cost and go immediately back to work next period. So this wage cost is meant to capture time spent in unemployment or, the cost of job search in an annual frequency model. And then in the model, frailty is going to impact individuals through these 5 channels that I've already discussed: labor productivity, mortality, their medical expenses, disutility from work, and probability of getting on DI. Okay, and so there's basically, you can be one of 4 different states in the model. You can be employed. We can allow both young people and people who are past full retirement age to work. And this is for an important reason that I'm going to explain when I get to the calibration section. But essentially these older workers are going to help us to identify model parameters. Both young and old workers can always choose to stop working. If you're young and you stop working, you go to the non-employment state. If you're old and you stop working, you go to the retirement state. And then non-employed workers, we assume that these people are trying to get on DI, and they have a positive probability of getting on DI that depends on their frailty and also the number of periods they've been in this non-employed state. And if you're not employed, you can always choose to go back to the employed state. Once you get on DI, however, we just assume that you stay on DI until retirement. This is because less than 1% of people who in the US who go on to these programs exit them for reasons other than, rolling into regular retirement or death. Retirees just collect Social Security benefits and don't work. And there's going to also be a government in the model that'll collect taxes. It'll pay out the benefits for these different programs. And it also finance a general welfare program that will guarantee everybody in the economy like a minimum level of consumption, and then also finance some non-valued exogenous government purchases. Okay, so here's the problem of a young employed individual. Here's the state. So their state depends on their age, assets, education, frailty, which depends on age and education, and frailty shocks, including a fixed effect, their productivity shock and fixed effect, and average past earnings. And the state also has an indicator for whether or not they're returning from a separation. And so with probability sigma, you become separated from your employer, and then next period, you either can go to the non-employment state, you stay in the non-employment state, or you can pay the wage cost and go immediately back to the employment state. With probability 1 minus sigma, you don't experience a separation. And in that case, you can always choose to go to the non-employment state. So, these separation shocks, why they're, I think, important in this model is, it kind of seems that, a good time to try to get on DI, right? So these kind of give people a push to say, now I've got to pay a cost to kind of stay in the labor market. Maybe I would rather just try to get on the DI program because, I have a lot of back pain or whatever.
I'm sorry
Um,
for a second. Could you please repeat the explanation why it is important to include this indicator?
all right, well, I'm just saying it's important to have separation shocks, I think, because, we want to model, people, when people are unemployed, that might be a good time to decide to go on to DI. So, right. So we think it's important to model unemployment risk because, if I lose my job and I'm already highly frail, I may say, oh, okay, I'm instead of paying this cost, I'm better off just, spending a period in non-employment and, trying to get onto the DI program. Right. At the same time, highly frail people, they can also just exit the labor market and, go to the non-employment state and try to get on DI. Okay. Okay. Now, the utility function is Cobb-Douglas in consumption and disutility from work. Disutility from work depends on frailty. So it's going to be increasing in frailty. And I'm going to talk about how we pin down these parameters in the calibration section. And then for an old employed individual, they differ from a young employed individual in a few different ways. One is that, they don't go to the non-employment state. They just go to retirement if they stop working. We give them the Social Security benefit. So we assume if you're, whether you're employed or not, if you're past full retirement age, you collect Social Security. And, their medical expense process is different. We estimate separate medical expense processes for retirees, actually for each of these different states, because now if you're a retiree, you get Medicare, and so your out-of-pocket medical expenses are going to look different than somebody who doesn't have access to Medicare. Okay, and then finally, these non-employed people. So like I said, these people, we assume that they're trying to get onto DI with this probability theta, they successfully get on DI and they move to DI next period. 1 minus theta, they don't get on DI, in which case they can stay in the non-employment state and try to get on DI again, or they can go back to employment and pay the wage cost. And the probability of getting on DI depends both on frailty and on the number of periods you've been applying. And this, again, I'll talk about in the calibration section, but we want to make sure that the model matches well the kind of, the expected duration of time you're going to spend trying to get on DI, because one of the kind of negatives of DI for people who are trying to get on in the US is that it can take quite a long time to get on this program. It's not something that can happen immediately, especially if you get denied in the first round. So basically people apply and then some people get on relatively quickly. And other people get denied and then they reapply, and you can continue to, reapply or appeal your denial for, years. And there are people who end up doing this for 10 or more years. And so we want to kind of make sure that the model captures well the average duration of time that people spend trying to get onto this program, because this is one of the costs of trying to do this. Okay. And then a DI beneficiary said they just stay on DI, and we keep track of the number of periods they've been on DI just because this impacts whether or not they get Medicare. And so their medical expenses depend on whether they've been on DI for at least 2 years. Okay, so let's talk about the calibration. The rest of the model, I didn't show you everything, but the rest of the model is very standard, and we solve for a standard stationary equilibrium. Okay. So just some of the highlights of the calibration. So like I said, a model period is 1 year, and agents can live for maximum 70 periods or up to age 94. They enter at age 25, and frailty is going to affect them right through these 5 channels. This I'm going to focus on when I talk about the calibration, because this is maybe the most novel part of the calibration. So how do we kind of pin down the impacts of frailty through these different channels? Well, for the first 3 channels, we estimate the frailty impacts outside the model. The second 2, we're going to use the model to kind of identify the effects. So for survival and out-of-pocket medical expenditures, we use MEPS and HRS data. And I'm not going to talk more about this. This is just pretty straightforward. For labor productivity, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but we do this outside the model, and we estimate the effect of frailty on labor productivity, controlling for selection effects, which the previous regressions I showed you didn't have any selection controls, but here we need to, we want the effect of frailty on wages, including for workers who choose to exit the labor market. And so we do an estimation controlling for selection. And then I'll talk about how we disentangle the role of the chances of getting on DI versus the disutility from work. Okay, but before I do that, let me just quickly mention how we model frailty dynamics. So we assume a positive fraction of people have 0 frailty at age 25, and this fraction declines with age. This is because, if you remember, I said earlier that in the data, there's about 24% of 25 to 34-year-olds have 0 frailty. And that fraction declines to less than 1% for people 85 plus. So we're going to explicitly model this. Then once individuals' frailty becomes positive, we assume that log frailty is the sum of an age polynomial and a stochastic component that includes a fixed effect, a transitory shock, and an AR1 shock. And like I said, because there's dramatically different health dynamics by education, we're going to estimate this process separately for each education group. We do this using an auxiliary simulation model, because if you also saw my talk yesterday, it's what I showed you is that it's extremely important to account for selection due to mortality when you estimate health dynamics over the life cycle, because perhaps not surprisingly, poor health and death are highly correlated. So we do this outside the model with a simpler simulation model where we simulate frailty and mortality dynamics over the life cycle, and we estimate that model via a simulated method of moments. And here's the moments that we target. This is the fraction with 0 frailty. This is mean log frailty by age, and this is the variance covariance matrix. So like these are age-specific autocovariance profiles that we target to pin down the stochastic component parameters. Oh, and this is just the high school graduate group. I'm not going to show you all 3 education groups. The high school graduates are the largest group in the model. And here you can see that if you don't model mortality, you're going to substantially underestimate kind of the rate of increase of frailty with age on average, and the increase in the variance over the life cycle. Okay, so for productivity, like I said, we estimate the impacts of frailty and productivity directly outside the model. And so we're going to allow for the deterministic component of the productivity process to be a function of an age polynomial and a quadratic frailty effect. And to estimate this quadratic frailty effect, we use the dynamic panel system GMM estimator, and we use a correction for selection bias. We use a procedure that was recommended by Al Sadoun and co-authors. And this procedure requires an exclusion restriction, and we use a very similar exclusion restriction to the one that was used by Lowe and Pistafari in a related paper. And I'm happy to talk in more detail about this, if anyone's interested, but I'm not going to do that extensively at this moment. But just to give you a sense of what we find, so we find that, after correction, we get slightly larger impacts of frailty on productivity. And even though we estimate quadratic effects, we actually find the effects are quite close to linear for the non-college group. So this just gives you a sense of the magnitudes. So we find that one additional deficit reduces wages by 4.4% for the non-college, for the high school dropouts, 2.7% for the high school graduates. For college, things look very different. We actually find that there's basically no effect of frailty on wages for everyone below the 76th percentile who are college graduates. And then we see that effects are, very nonlinear. And so this is just kind of picking one high percentile group, the 95th percentile. If you're already at the 95th percentile of frailty and you're a college graduate, one additional deficit reduces your wages by 2.8%. Just to give you a sense of how that looks. Okay, so what remains now to pin down using the model, in addition to some other parameters that are pinned down my standard targets, are these DI probability and disutility of work parameters. And to pin down these targets, these parameters, we target DI recipiency rates by age and frailty, and labor force participation rates by age and frailty for 25 to 74-year-olds, and also the relative DI acceptance rate by number of years tried. And the reason now, this here is the reason why we model individuals' labor choices of individuals over the age of 65, is that we're going to use the dispersion in the labor force participation rates by frailty for 65 to 74-year-olds to help us identify the disutility of work effect separately from the DI probability effect. And this is because, once you hit full retirement age, you're no longer eligible for DI. So the probabilities of getting on DI don't have any direct effects on labor force participation of people over the age of 65. And so their variation in labor supply by frailty is going to help us pin down, how frailty impacts the disutility of work. So here are the moments in the data. A couple things to point out. One is that, we choose the percentiles of the frailty distribution to target that are concentrated in the tail, because like I mentioned, all of the action is in the tail. So we really want to make sure that the model matches well DI recipiency and labor force participation rates in the unhealthy tail of the distribution. And you can see exactly what I was saying before in another way right here, is that, the differences in DI recipiency and labor force participation, like between the 0 to 50th percentile of frailty and the 50th to 70th, are tiny, right? So below the 70th percentile, there's really not much going on. And so really, compared to the differences between the 90 to 95th and the 95th to 100, where you see, huge differences in how many people are on DI and how many people are working at all these different ages. And here's the model fit. And so you can see that we are able to match this dispersion in labor force participation rates for these 65 to 74-year-olds. And we find that the DI probability, both DI probability and disutility from working, are increasing in convex and frailty. And we also, like I said, match this relative decline in the probability of getting on DI by years since initial application. And this is what really pins down the importance of the number of years that you've been applying, that we keep track of in the model. Okay, how much time do I have?
About 5 minutes.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so now we want to understand the impact of health inequality on lifetime earnings inequality. So the way we do this with the model is we're going to now consider a counterfactual economy where everyone has the same average frailty profile. So we're going to remove all the variation in frailty except the variation by age. So this is removing all kind of cross-sectional variation due to education or fixed effects, and also, due to shocks. And then we're going to look at the impact on inequality in lifetime earnings at each age. And lifetime earnings is just the sum of all earnings up to that age. The way we're going to measure inequality is as the variance of log. And here's what we find. So here's the variance of log lifetime earnings in the benchmark. This orange line is the variance in the economy where everybody has the same average frailty profile, which is just the average frailty profile. So you can see that there's very little difference in the variance of log lifetime earnings until you get to about age 35. And then these things start to differ. By age 65, the variance of log lifetime earnings in the economy with no frailty heterogeneity is 30% lower. So this is where that headline 30% number is coming from. Removing health inequality reduces lifetime earnings inequality by 30% at age 65. Okay, so let's see if we can understand the importance of these different channels. So to understand the relative importance of each of these channels, we're going to run a series of counterfactuals. And the way this is going to work is that in each counterfactual, we're going to shut down the variation in frailty in that specific channel only. So for example, when we remove the impact of health inequality in the DI channel only, everybody's going to have, the economy is going to be exactly equivalent to the baseline. Everyone's going to have exactly the same frailty as in the baseline, except that when we calculate people's probability of getting on DI, we're going to use the average frailty profile to determine DI probability. And then in counterfactual 2, for everyone's frailty is going to be exactly whatever their frailty dynamics were in the baseline, except that when we calculate their labor productivity, we're going to use the average frailty profile and so on. And what do we basically find? First, we find that, disutility, medical expense, and survival channels don't play a very big role in accounting for our result. The result is pretty much overwhelmingly due to the DI channel. So just using average frailty to determine people's probability of getting on DI reduces lifetime earnings inequality by 21% at age 65. Interestingly, at younger ages, this, doing this actually increases lifetime earnings inequality. I'll show you why in just a moment. And then the second most important channel is labor productivity. So using the labor productivity, using the average frailty profile to determine labor productivity reduces earnings by a bit over 4% at age 65. Okay, and so just to understand what's going on, when we use the average frailty profile to determine the DI probability, then now these are the very frail people, the people in the top 5% of the frailty distribution. This is their labor force participation rates. And so now these highly frail individuals, they no longer qualify for DI with high probability, right? Their probability of getting on DI is determined by the average frailty in the economy, not their own frailty. And so at older ages, if I'm highly frail now and I have low probability of getting on DI, then my labor supply goes up. But you actually get the opposite effect at these younger ages. So highly frail people who are very young now, they actually have an incentive to just exit the labor force sooner. And the reason is that they're forward looking and they see, oh, now I'm no longer going to be able to get on DI in the future. And this reduces the incentive to stay in the labor force to accumulate SSDI earnings credits. SSDI in the US pays out the same replacement rate function as Social Security. So there's this incentive to kind of accumulate average earnings so that you get a higher benefit. And this effect is removed, and that's kind of the dominant impact on the labor supply of these younger workers. And so they just drop out and go on to the general welfare, means tested welfare program. The productivity channel, like I said, if you use average frailty to determine productivity, for these highly frail people, their wages go up, and then this increases their labor supply at all ages. Okay, so I'm basically done. Let me just talk about the welfare effects. And then, so what do we find? So like I said before, we found that the DI channel is the primary channel through which health inequality increases lifetime earnings inequality. So should we eliminate this program given that it contributes to inequality? And we find that the answer is no. Removing the program reduces ex-ante welfare. So if you just remove the benefits and the payroll taxes, and you do this in partial equilibrium, so you don't readjust the government budget constraint, average welfare falls by 1.2% ex ante. And not surprisingly, the welfare losses are concentrated in less educated people. College people are actually happy about removing this program, because the college people are the primary payers, less educated people are the primary beneficiaries. When you remove this program, their substitution outlays for the general welfare program go up, right? Because some people now, they can't get on, there's no DI program, so they instead rely on the general means tested program. So depending on how you kind of pay for those additional government outlays, the welfare effects become larger. And, if you pay for them with higher income taxes, then, this additional cost is disproportionately paid by the college grads. If you pay for them by reducing the consumption floor until you balance the budget, then you disproportionately push this cost onto the less educated people. Okay, so just to conclude, we find a large response of earnings to incremental changes in frailty, mostly driven by participation and wage effects for less educated workers. And then in a structural model, we find that health inequality accounts for a substantial fraction of lifetime earnings inequality at age 65. And this is primarily due to the fact that individuals in poor health have a high probability of going onto SSDI and SSI, and they do so. And so, yeah, despite the fact that this program really plays a crucial role in driving this relationship between health inequality and lifetime earnings inequality, we find that this is a ex-ante welfare improving program.
Thank you very much. We probably have time for a couple of questions. I can see that Hamish Lowe had a few questions in the chat. Maybe you can come online and ask them for everybody to hear. Thank you, Hamish.
Sure. I guess the kind of key one, I think, is trying to think about what the welfare conclusions mean. So in a way, I don't find it tough, but I completely pulls. Actually, I really enjoyed this, by the way. Really interesting set of results. I really enjoyed it. So I think what's interesting about this is you've got this kind of welfare loss that differs according to where you are in the distribution. But for people at different points in distribution, there's two things going on. One's an insurance benefit and the other is a redistribution benefit. So for people at the bottom, they get this value because they're getting redistributed. They don't have to pay the taxes that people further up are paying. So when you say there's a welfare gain or welfare loss, it's not clear whether it's due to the redistribution or whether it's due to the insurance. So what would be really nice would be to think about the correction rather than doing a payroll tax, which is just in this kind of progressive way, to make the redistribution done in terms of a kind of income specific to the particular individual or particular income group. And that way you'll be able to see the value of the insurance for that group rather than just the redistribution.
Yeah, I want to make sure I understand, because I agree with you. And this is something we actually thought about but haven't done, is exactly, it'd be nice to decompose this exactly into like the insurance, because I think that both are playing a role, because so it'd be nice to get a sense of how much of this is redistribution versus insurance. But can you just tell me one more time how you suggest to do it? Because so you're saying
be very careful.
When we balance when we do the GE here, we do it through income. Yeah.
So always be wary of people coming up with suggestions on the fly. But I think what I was saying was you've got a group of people, and here you've got a change in the income taxes, which you're making common across all the education groups. And a simple way of doing it would be to just do the adjustment to get the balanced budget. Do it within an education group.
Yes, do it within an education group.
So in some ways,
and then you're only giving them insurance and not redistribution.
Yeah,
exactly. So like within your own education group, you pay. Yeah, and that's a way to, I think, decompose, separate out the redistribution that works through education. But there may be another form of redistribution here that also works through kind of who sort of has low. There's a fixed effect in frailty distribution. So some people are kind of born with relatively poor health, and so there's also redistribution towards those people, right? So yeah, we could do. You're right. We could do a decomposition to understand redistribution by education, but we could also do something to capture redistribution by kind of initial conditions in terms of your health status.
Well, one other thing you could do is you could think about you do the simulation, you do the calculation in your baseline, and that calculates the total amount of money that's being spent on each individual. And so then you've got a kind of individual specific revenue situation, if you like. So for some people, that's going to be to get a huge transfer. Other people, it's going to be there's a big cost. And then you could do your simulations in a kind of person-specific way. I'm not saying you want to do this for a lot of different cases, but you can do it in a person-specific way that then holds constant the amount that the transfer that particular individual gets from the government. And you could do it in a tax way. We could do it in a lump sum way for that individual. But that would be the extreme. So education's one situation. You could do it in terms of looking at the kind of initial fixed effects, or you could do the extreme thing, which I just said, which is where you're calculating the revenue by each individual. But I just think that separating that out is, I think, a really interesting kind of way to take this.
Yeah, no, I think these are really good suggestions. Thank you. Because yeah, this is something, like we also thought we should exactly, we've been thinking about the same thing, but we haven't exactly figured out how to do it. So these are great ideas. Yeah, thanks a lot.
One question from John Rust here.
A very nice paper, Karen, and just like yesterday. So did you look at actually making DI more generous because you look at a lot of people on DI, they have very shoddy work histories, and they're living at poverty line. And I guess it's the old the moral hazard, so it'd be, if you raised it, you'd have some moral hazard, but I would think it'd be secondary compared to the welfare effect.
Yeah, in the paper, we also look at 10% increase in the DI benefit, right? Because there's multiple ways that you can make the program more generous. You can increase the kind of probability of getting on, or how the probability varies with frailty or number of years since application, or you can just raise kind of the benefit level for everybody. So we did look at a 10% increase in just the benefit levels proportionally, and that raises welfare in this model, in this economy.
But the problem if you do that is you do that, and that will then, you're holding constant the probabilities of success. If you're going to increase the generosity level, you're going to get a lot more false applicants.
Yeah, but well, in the model though, we find that even, so in the model, you do get more people that go on the program. So yeah, so that's taken into account in this welfare calculation. So you can increase the benefit level in our model. More people are going to now try to get on because the benefits have gone up, and so the costs do go up, but the additional welfare that the people who are on the program get kind of outweighs the additional costs in terms of people trying to get on the program, at least in the model world. But yeah, you could also try to think about other ways of changing the program to kind of like you could think about playing around with who gets on the program, how that varies with frailty, because that has both impacts in terms of kind of welfare benefits to these highly frail people, but also like output in the cost of financing the program, in terms of perhaps you want to get more of the relative to what you get currently in the in the baseline, because these people are highly productive and can contribute to financing the benefits for the highly frail individuals. So you could kind of play around with who gets benefits as well. We haven't really done that.
So let's thank Karen once again for the wonderful talk.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think we should move on to the talk by Christopher Ferrall on the college choice and credit constraints.
Thanks again for including me and organizing this through probably very difficult times. And also very much thank you for changing the time of the session so that I was not up at 5:30 in the morning. So this is joint work with Mike Barber, and it's very much in progress. Unlike some of the other papers we've seen already that I was able to attend, we're going to have sort of preliminary results, and I'll focus more on how we're setting things up and some special things that we think are going on in the model and what we're trying to do. A little less on, the policy implications, certainly in the current version. Okay, so many of you would be aware of the US education system and some of the peculiarities. That's some of our motivation. Here's some stylized facts that helped us kind of get started on this. Over at least, say, since 1980, tuition has been going up a lot faster than inflation. A lot of need-based grants are available, but there's stagnant limits on subsidized student loan borrowing in the face of this. Something that probably people know, but can be shocking if you're not from the US, that private schools are about 3 times as expensive as public universities. Now, private schools do engage in this sort of price discrimination, this sort of ability to pay pricing, which we're not going to be able to take account of, but so keep that in mind. That is one issue as well. There's just been evidence as well that some of this has been driving a stronger correlation between, say, degree attainment in the US and family income over this time. So this was some of our stylized facts. So here's some non-stylized facts that I just thought to just time period that our data are looking at, 95 to 2010, give or takes. This is an average of public four-year universities in the US. This is tuition fees, room and board. You can see that these are in nominal terms. So basically the cost has doubled in these 15 years, which obviously is a lot faster than consumer prices. And I just picked Harvard just to make it clear you could get this for private average as well. Basically it's kept up and it still remains about 3 times as expensive. So some of this is what sustains these differences. We are not going to be looking at response to the change in the prices as much as because we have a single cohort. But okay, so what this paper does is develops a life cycle model. It's sort of a life cycle model that's at the other end of the life cycle, focusing on sort of the first decision people make as opposed to what happens every way. We will simplify the end of life greatly, but it won't be completely inconsistent with, say, Karen's paper, and we'll focus on what people are doing in terms of choosing college attendance and so forth. So we're going to model college quality choice in the sense of the more expensive versus the less expensive schools. We're going to account for student borrowing, work, and loan repayment. And, oops, sorry. And we're going to estimate the model using the NLSY 97, which a lot of people have used. This is one reason why I'm not going to have a lot of results, in terms of policy experiments, is we're now augmenting it with some CPS data from the same cohort, and you'll see why. We needed some more data to kind of pin down some things, and so that's the size of the NLSY population. We're looking for some extra sort of moments for borrowing as well, so you'll see that. And our goal is to disentangle the selection into school qualities, the value of different universities in terms of, say, wage premiums, tastes, which would be similar to sort of the non-pecuniary returns to just going to different universities, and how these things determine labor market returns. And we're going to have different policies, some different counterfactuals, but I'm not going to be talking about those today. Okay, a few details. So we're going to endogenize choice among 4 college types. You'll see that in a second, what that means. We're going to model youth attendance at university. So these we're going to look at high school graduates. They can work during school or not attend. They're accumulating credits towards a degree. They're borrowing, and they're receiving parental transfers and government grants. And that's a number of these things are sort of mechanical relative to some of the other things that are more modeled in detail. And then this is sort of the life cycle part that basically there's a transition to adulthood. And so actually the problem changes, and they now move into loan repayment. They can default or miss payments, and we're not, again, because the NLSY is limited, we're not trying to get all the details on default exact, but we are accounting for that when people are starting out and starting to pay loans. You do have savings, so there is a reason to borrow and to smooth consumption, and a continued work and job search as before. Okay. A lot of literature. I'm only going to mention a few papers, a lot more obviously referenced. So papers on the 2 papers that we're really kind of starting with on schooling and credit constraints, there are the Keenan-Wolfen 2001 paper and a paper by Johnson. We use some of his asset data as well. There's a survey of this from 2011 as well. College quality, one paper that's looked at this. So of course there have been a number of papers that have looked at, say, coefficients on different universities in a wage regression. But in terms of sort of a model of choosing which type of college to go to. There's Zhao Fu's paper, which is a static equilibrium model that she estimates. We use her same categories of education. But of course, a lot of what's happening in her model is mechanistic in our model, because we're accounting for the life cycle effects. And there's a lot of literature or papers in the macro sort of equilibrium world now, looking at educational attainment, credit constraints, to our my colleague Brian Abbott and Calcutt and Lochner. These are two of them that sort of either calibrate or estimate with GMM equilibrium models. And again, they're not going to sort of account for different college qualities and some of the other details, but they also have sort of equilibrium responses that we don't have. Let me put in a shameless plug for my package. So we do the calculations in this package called Niclo, which allows you to set up models like this, design them, kind of take off the shelf components, solve them, estimate them using maximum likelihood or GMM, or CMM, or sorry, simulated method moments, although I emphasize that less. We'll see that in a second. If you want to see the context, I've got a paper here that puts it in context. So the other thing is, for the students in the room, if you're interested, I provide basically not round the clock support if you end up using my package. So you might find it useful in terms of thinking about how to set up models as well as kind of getting started. All right. Let me talk a little bit about the model and some of these details, and some that are different, that we're trying to pick up some of the things that have been missing in the existing literature. So it's a non-stationary infinite horizon problem. And our notation is that people are choosing an action vector of actions, alpha. There's a state, theta, and we have fixed groups, exogenous differences, which are gamma. The value function is standard. That might look a little different. We're integrating out the extreme value shock here, but otherwise it's pretty, it's very standard. And I'll get some details. I'm going to click not on right now, but later on a picture that kind of summarizes what's happening over the life cycle here. Okay, so first the heterogeneity. There's 3 fixed values. One is this unobserved ability term. This is, you'll see this on some of the other slides here. This is just the number of different values they take on. So right now we just have 3 levels of ability. And then we have 4 groups from the LSY, sort of a test score bin and a parent income bin. And we allow that the distribution of ability depends on test scores and parental income. So this isn't a deep ability, sort of innate. It's if parents are rich parents are putting in more resources, and that's upping their ability, well, we're accounting for that. So we're treating it sort of as lagged endogenous in some sense. Okay, so the action vector includes all these variables, and again with the number of choices that people have or options people have. They're going to choose what kind of college they're going to go to. There are going to be 4 of them, including an option just to say I'm never going to go to college. You can tend or not while young. You can borrow or not, sort of full amount or half amount or nothing. Work part-time or full-time. Once you get older, you can, or you may be forced to miss a payment if you have loans. And so we model that as a choice, but really you're forced into that based on not having enough money. And finally, you're able to save to smooth consumption as you get older. Okay. The idea of the life cycle is that the set of feasible choices you're choosing from depends. So you're not choosing all these things all at once, which would be prohibitively expensive and, you know, just not practical. So I'll say a little more about that. So here are the states. This is
Question. We have a question from Jay Kang here about the restrictions of choice, for example, with respect to the quality of colleges, since not all of them may be available for all the students.
Yeah, I'll get to that. We have again a mechanistic version of that that's included. All right, so there are 25 different periods, but the last period is stationary, so you live forever in that period, in that last period. That's why it's an infinite horizon, but non-stationary. This answers that question. There are 3 sets of feasible choices of quality. So this is unobserved. So which ones you're able to actually go to will end up depending on your ability. And we have to keep track of which school you are going to attend, or it's probably bad notation, but I picked something that no one tends to use. I didn't want to use a hat, but this brev mark says this is a state variable that just is completely determined by a past choice. So that includes whether you've missed a payment in the past. I think you can see my cursor, I hope. And your previous savings determines what your assets are coming into this period. These other variables with capital letters, obviously they're also dependent on past choices, but not directly, just in terms of notation. So we have to keep track of how long you've been out of school. And this is sort of this endogenous transition that if you stay away from university long enough, you grow up. Or if you just run out of time. We keep track of total loans, student loans, credits while they're in school, whether you've earned a degree or not, which is in our case just going to be if you've earned 4 years of credit. And a skill, which if you notice, we take on 10 values, and so we're accounting a lot of the state space is to pick up that. And that's the standard labor market type skill. It's going to be determined by credits and ability, as I'll explain later. All right, it's not really a new state variable, but there's this sort of phase of your life cycle, and it's dependent on time, T, and how long you've been away from school, which is capital H as in hooky for you know, the North Americans. That's what it meant to skip school in the old days. And there are 3. You start out young, and then you move to this sort of adult phase, and then the 3rd phase matures just like where I am. I'm just, every day is the same, and not much is happening. So that's our last stationary period, okay? So you move to adulthood when you've missed school for 2 years, okay? And that's the endogenous transition. Or we just cap you at after 13 years. So some of the people in the audience might be, you know, you might be bumping up to that T equals 13. You might have to finish your PhD more quickly. While you're young, you can do all these things, as I think briefly mentioned before. When you're old, these things go away. This is partly to keep the state space from blowing up. Now you can save, you build skill through learning by doing. That's what LBD is, standard kind of Mitzer type effect. And last period, stationary. I'm going to click on this now. I think you will see this picture. Maybe not. It's supposed to show up. I'm going to, okay, I'll skip that.
Another clarifying question from Andrew Pop.
Yes.
About the missed payment state. Does it revert back to the missed payment after some time?
You'll see that in a second. So do you see a little diagram here, like a flow chart? I think, do you still see my slide? there should be a image on the page or not. It says
We
applicants.
still see your slide.
Okay, it's because I opened up a new window. All right, I was afraid of that. Let me see if I can share this. Okay, sorry, I didn't test this now. I think now you see a image. Great. Sorry, I'll have to go back to my regular slides after this. So this is the idea. You make a once and for all choice.
To make it a little bit larger.
Sure, that I can do. And I'll just, so you make a once and for all choice what school quality you go to. One thing is we're lumping in 2-year colleges and 4-year public universities. So if you start out in community college and then transfer, that's the same quality. We're not accounting for that. There is a literature about that difference, but a lot of people, that's how they kind of get started. So this idea that you're picking one quality doesn't, not many people switch from going to Harvard and then switching to go to, let's say, the University of Wyoming. That doesn't happen that much. So that kind of switch we rule out. And I'll say a little more about that later. If you do choose to keep the option of attending, then you have 13 years to attend. You can keep attending, do these other things, including work. Once you've left for 2 periods, that's when you grow up. Your parents now abandon you. The government abandons you in terms of grants. And you're now in the adult phase where if you have loans, we model it. It's not exact. It's partly to reduce numbers of states. You pay back loans over 8 periods. There's at least 2 periods sort of post that period, and then you go into the stationary world. And if you don't have any loans, then you just basically have all this, I think, 10 periods to work, and that's when you're accumulating skill. And to simplify things in the stationary world, you actually don't have skill accumulation. Okay, so hopefully I'm back to my slide, and that's the idea. So this was the question, what choices are feasible? So it's a once and for all choice at age 18. You choose from one of the set that you have. Everyone's a high school graduate, so everyone has the option of just never going to college or going to a public school. You could even allow for high school graduation endogenous, and that could be possible. It wouldn't probably be worth the effort in our case. Then, as a function of your ability, so it's like universities get a signal, you get the option of going to either an elite public school, which would be something like Berkeley, UCLA, Michigan, as opposed to the California State universities, et cetera, or a private school, which would be in some cases like small liberal arts colleges. And the third group is the elite private schools, which are the Harvards, the Chicagos, Stanfords, et cetera. And they're not that many people at those schools. So there's, in some sense, it is possible you can imagine merging some of these, but these are the categories that FU use, so that's why we've used those. You probably can't see this. Let me blow it up. No, that's not going to work. This is probably going to be small. So I think I'll just skip this. This is just our group categories, our test score and income categories, and just the distribution of college quality types in the data. But maybe if the other one was small, this is probably small. We'll see some of this later anyway. So this is sort of the first thing we're going to try to pick up. Credits, they just accumulate based on ability, school quality, and whether you're working in school or not, that can have an effect. We're just going to have degree earned if you have 4 credits. your initial adult skill. So again, when you grow up, you get this initial skill, and it depends on your credits. So the way you can think of credits as like chips in a casino, you're in the casino, have some chips, but they're not worth anything outside the casino. You go cash them in, you walk out with money, hopefully. Same thing with credits in university. They don't mean anything once you grow up, but what happens is your initial skills will depend on the credits you've earned. And it's still random in the sense that you shift the distribution of initial skill. And then otherwise you then just keep accumulating as usual. All right, so loan repayment, this again is an approximation that there's a lifetime limit on subsidized student loan borrowing, LBAR. And there's an interest rate that goes with that. And actually you don't have to start paying until you grow up, which is not quite right. It gives them a little more time than in the reality to start paying, but it matches up with what we're doing. And this H0 is just the amount that the payment over 8 years that you have to have based on that interest rate. You can borrow from the market at a higher rate up to a maximum just because it's discrete finite programming. And this is the scheduled payment over 8 years. So this is just the standard payment. This is how much you need to amortize your loan. And then if you've missed a payment in the past, there's a penalty. And the question was, this is permanent. So once you've missed a payment, which is stronger than the reality in the rules, you pay a penalty. And so this is almost closer to default. It's sort of in between this little m. When would you miss payment? Well, we just fix it that this is where it's really more than just missing one payment. If what you owe that year is 90% of your gross income, which hasn't been defined yet, but you'll see it in a second. And then from then on, if you miss payment, then they can garnish your wages in our model up to 50% of your earnings. So that's our payment. It accounts for missing payments due to shocks, a penalty. And the other thing that's not mentioned here is that the interest rate that you earn on savings is lower if you're in default. So it's our attempt to pick up the costs of missing student loan payments. All right, let's see. Earnings are pretty standard. Just capital W is full-time equivalent earnings. Little w is how much you're working, either part-time or full-time. When you're young, you can earn. A is attend. So this part is the net cost of attending, including what you borrow, and you can get transfers from your parents. And you can get transfers whether you're attending or not, as long as you're young. But they can depend on whether they do depend on whether you're attending or not. When you're adult, this is gross income. So it's just earnings plus interest on your savings coming into the period. And then your consumption is your actual payment, including those costs, minus what you save for next period. So that's fairly standard. Here's one thing where I want to spend a couple minutes, because I think this has not been done before, and it's sort of come up in previous talks, so it might be worth doing. So let me click on this. This unfortunately probably means I'm going to, sorry, I will have to share again, just my picture. And this is a very fancy picture of what we're doing with utility. Hopefully, so I can't remember which paper I saw earlier that said we have a consumption flow. I think it was Hans Martin's paper. Sorry, consumption floor. So you have people who end up with, in the model, looking like they have zero negative consumption. And this is always an issue when you have risk aversion. We want that because we want people borrowing and facing constraints and having a reason to smooth consumption. So we have, as they're adult, they have curved utility, standard risk aversion. Now, if we made it when they were young going to school, you have this problem. And the problem is, hypothetically, someone's going to Harvard, whereas you see they may be charging, we don't include room and board, but let's say tuition, $30,000. And given the data, it's very likely that if they did choose that, they're going to have negative consumption. And then you also have that if you, and that not even necessarily Harvard, but if the transfers that are NLSY from parents and grants don't guarantee this at all, partly because of noise in them. So if you had that and you just said, well, young people have that same floor, one of the problems with that is that if you start changing tuition policies, you get no effect, because if they had negative consumption, but you gave them a floor, then you change the tuition a little bit, still negative effect, there's no response. So our solution is to shift the utility function between young and adult. And when young, the utility is linear. And this allows for negative consumption. And it's like the idea that your parents or society or the university is somehow supporting you, but in this way in which you're still responsive to changes in tuition, because you still like more consumption than less, even though it's linear. Now, part of the problem was originally we just fixed this, but the problem is you're also endogenously moving to adulthood. If you stay in school and you pay and then you leave for a year and then go back, you can stretch out your youth if for some reason the linear utility just looks better. So what we do is we tie them together. And so we picked an arbitrary number. If you think there's a better number, that'd be great. $10,000 in consumption per year, $2,004. And at that point, the utility is the same as when young as old, and the slope is the same. So that's the idea that we're tying the two together. So this is partly what's the life cycle phase. It's a different approach than just having a floor. There's still sort of a zero here for adults, but it's less important in our model because we don't. Okay, so let me just go back to my regular slide. Right, that.
Speed you up, but there is 9 minutes remaining.
Great. Okay. Okay. I've just said all this. I'll skip that. I'll skip size of model. It's big, but my code also trims the state space sort of for you. So it, and partly because of these other things about the model. Here's a quick summary of all the things that are going on. These are sort of the equations in the model. Most of them are standard, even though they may look a little different. One thing is we're allowing for the discount factor to depend on ability between 0.9 and 0.999. So there's heterogeneity in that. And I think I will just, if I can, I may skim through these very quickly. It's faster than trying to find my point in the model, and just get to data. So we're using GMM, and we have the geocode data, but we're outside the US. So in the NLSY, the data on things like which school you go to, you attend, you have to have the geocode data. Well, Mike was in the US for 1 year and was able to get the NLSY data with the geocode, restricted confidential data. But we knew that we'd be doing this for a while. So we just generated a lot of moments, hoping that the moments that we generate and then we're able to take outside the US and outside the secure area would cover it. That also means that, at some point we might go back and get some other stuff. For students, this is like, for example, at least the second time, maybe the third, where I've been in this situation where if you're going to do this kind of work using administrative data, confidential data, it's quite likely that the data are not going to be available on a computer that you can sit and run for 2 months or in parallel on 100 processors. So GMM is often something that allows you to take the non-individual data out and use them. The downside is obviously you lose a lot of information, but it's a trade-off. We calculate the moments. We don't simulate it, and it's part of the setup of my code. You could do both, but it's costlier to sort of directly calculate the predictions of the model, but it's also smooth, and there's no issues about sort of setting the randomness. Right now, we're just sort of kind of setting our weights arbitrarily with some account for the standard deviation. Eventually, we'll simulate the optimal weights. All right. I need to go a little faster, obviously. We've got male high school graduates through 2011. Again, we haven't been able to go back and get more recent LSYs. We associate the people who never attend university with the 0. So this is an issue where basically we're ex post saying, oh, they never attended, so they just gave up the option, which is not perfect, but otherwise you get this problem that you don't know whether to put them in the, say, public or not, even though they never attend. And to control this, we have this thing that you can't really interpret as a real cost. It's just a cost of choosing a college at that age 18, which just allows the model to sort of determine how to hit the Q equals 0 component. Otherwise, everyone would keep the option open and you wouldn't have anyone choosing 0. So that's an issue, and unless you're going to keep people choosing every year among 5 schools and account for transfers and costs of switching, which of course then eats up a lot of costs, this seems to be one way to do it. We have data from the NLS on these things. We're picking some other moments. There's 3 observations of assets from that Johnson computed. So we're kind of targeting those in that sense, or they're included in the moments. Right now, we're just picking a lifetime default of 10%. Right now, it's overshooting that. But again, it's very hard to get a lot of data on missing payments in the US, but we're struggling to find something that we can match up to things in the model other than just we want it not to be 80%. And this is where we've added sort of this extra data on earnings and degree status and work on from the CPS for the same people. This is not worth seeing. This is just a chart. You can look at it maybe in the slides. This is a chart of the moments that we're matching, interacting with school type, and the aggregate ones that are not coming from the NLSY. Kurt, yes.
We should start wrapping it up. We have about 3 minutes.
Great. All right, let me, these are the current estimates, or not quite the current estimates, maybe from 2 days ago. So this is attendance by permanent type. So these are the low income, low test score. Over here, high test score, high income. And we're matching attendance, no problem. Earnings, this is again averaging over all the college types. We're matching that fine. This is attending and working full-time if you're in a public university. And, we're picking up, you can see, for example, here, these people start out working less in the data than the model predicts. That's the kind of thing that's not going to be easy to match. Borrowing, people tend to borrow less than the model, like the cost. This is one reason to sort of put some restrictions on paying back, being strict on it, because people just don't seem to borrow as much as the model would want them to do. Let me skip a couple more. Degrees. This is again averaging over the types. I have some by type as well. This is college. These are people who set Q equals 0, never attend college. And you can see there are some groups where over in this upper right corner, there's a gap. It's harder to pick them up. These are people who went to a public university. That's most people, right? So there's the moments are kind of going to fit probably better anyway there. We're picking that up. Private earnings are okay. These are the Harvards of the world. And this is the issue. One reason why I didn't even decide to run policy experiments, just for an example. So what happens is the model at the point that we ran out of data had no reason to have wages continue to grow after about age 30 when the LSY. So when we got to the CPS, this is the CPS data for the same men in the same age cohort and over time, and you can see it, the profiles there. So that's what we're doing right now. We're now adding these moments, and we're now it's gonna affect the skill accumulation to match that, and then of course affect a lot of other things. And I think I have no last words except that's where we're at. Welcome comments.
Thank you very much. So if we have one question from the audience, I can see there are questions in the Zulip, but Chris is there, and I hope the discussion can continue in text. Do we have a question from the audience here? No. Well, thank you so much again. Let's thank Chris for the presentation.
Thank you.